features, and you're listening to ShowX Live with Ken in a student accommodation all the way in Scotland. Wait, that was years ago. You're listening to ShowX Live with your favorite Scotsman Ken, currently residing in the US of A, and Wayne, mostly from Colorado.
Hey, wait a second. I'm on the show too, and I don't get any billing at all? Well, I know how to solve this. Soldater, Fremad, March! You're listening to Show X with our favorite Scotsman Ken, our child of the corn Wayne, currently living in Colorado, and Todd, who now has an army of angry Norwegians at his back. Enjoy the show!
Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to the show. It's 2 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. GMT on this Sunday, the 31st, last day of the first month of 2021. So welcome to the show today, guys. So we are going to be talking about recent events and kind of the culmination of how things have continued to progress over the past, I don't know, like, what are we at, 7 years potentially of uptick in internet interactions and such. But we're going to be looking at a little bit about culture today, what is happening when it comes to the idea or the perception that there is perhaps some kind of uptick in the way that management of content and how some people can see it as censorship or such, and the potential fallout of all of this and how it relates to how culture today seems to feel the action that needs to be taken to manage people who voice opinions, thoughts, ideas, and facts and things out on the internet, and kind of tying all of that together today. So that's going to be our primary goal for the show today. And I was thinking prior to it whether there was one thing to start on or not. I'm not sure myself, so I'll leave it to you, Todd, if you get us kicked off. Okay. And I need to remember to log into the emails to see if there's any discussion from previous weeks and stuff. I forgot to do that first thing.
So, this goes back, I guess, almost 2 weeks now. But what even set me off on this, like, we had sort of set the table for doing a follow-up CES show last week. And so figuring that we had promised that and that was locked in, when I saw this quote, it was like, we got to talk about this on the show. So we did the CES follow-up last week, and now we get to, this is a quote. The quote that set me off is from Alex Stamos, who is a ex-chief security officer for Facebook, who on Brian Stelter's show on CNN said, and this is the quote, "We have to turn down the capability of these conservative influencers to reach these huge audiences. There are people on YouTube, for example, that have a larger audience than daytime CNN." End quote.
Okay.
And I went, well, wait a second. CNN sucks. And they've peddled as much or more misinformation than anybody else. And that was the larger context of the discussion. Was like, oh, we've got, One American News Network and Newsmax, and they're misinformation peddlers, and how could we possibly, how could a person possibly know, like, what's the correct information? And we need Facebook to crack down on, and Twitter to crack down on misinformation, and we got to do something about the YouTube, because more people watch the YouTube than watch daytime CNN, which, as far as I know, the only people who watch daytime CNN are, Washington Beltway insider people and captive audiences at airports, except no one's at an airport because you can't travel.
Well, so, admittedly, I have a couple of the top broadcast news networks up in my office 24/7. So,
right, yeah, okay, another captive audience. I mean, it's not like they can turn that off, right? So this is not new. The legacy media has been after this for a long time. And the smear, near as I can remember, probably goes all the way back to 2014. But it was really 2018 when somebody decided to pay for some academic backing behind it. And now it's led up all the way to what's been happening with Wall Street Bets and GameStop. You know, I put a screen cap or a link to a Reddit thread where the Financial Times. Where did it go? Did I delete it? I may have deleted it. Shoot. Well,
in general, still, yeah.
So anyway, so what happened was the Financial Times, when the story about this first broke, and I'm not going to get into too deep because I think we're going to cover it in much more detail next week. But the Financial Times wrote a story that tied the Wall Street Bets subreddit to the alt-right with no evidence whatsoever. And then quickly posted a retraction. It's like, oh, we put a speculative statement in our article tying the alt-right to our Wall Street Bets. We didn't really mean that.
Okay,
so
I think,
like our
wait,
bad.
I think I have it. It's
Okay.
Let's see if I'm sharing this correctly. Boom. Where it says, for most Americans, GameStop is struggling brick-and-mortar video game retailer. For investors, the company has become the epicenter of a war between hedge fund pros and so-called Reddit bros. Their concerted buying has pushed the stock up 1,700% since the start of the year, forcing short seller Melvin Capital to seek a cash injection from allies. It would be tempting to dismiss the Reddit bros as, quote, some of the alt-right supporters as dumb money and their frenzied buying as a Ponzi scheme. Instead, this is a cautionary tale of how social media can be co-opted to attack the financial establishment. Reddit may be changing Wall Street in the way Twitter and Facebook change politics.
Yep. So there it is. There it is inside the dashes. Some of them alt-right supporters. And that has been the how do I want to say this? The smear du jour of the legacy media now for what, 7 years? And it really does go all the way back to Gamergate, but it I would say got its most prominence in 2018. So what happened in 2018? May 2018, Bari Weiss, then of the New York Times, wrote an op-ed on the intellectual dark web. So Eric and Bret Weistein, Heather Heying, Dr. Deborah So, Christina Hoff Sommers, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Douglas Murray, Ben Shapiro, Claire Lehmann. If you don't know who Claire Lehmann is, she's she runs Quillette, which is sort of an alternative news and commentary type of website. They do a lot of long form written content.
Okay.
This Quillette was the site that I heard about or read about the researchers that were looking into rapid onset gender dysphoria that were that basically said we can't get our research published anywhere because there's a narrative and you can't do research that violates the narrative, which is another discussion altogether. 3 months later, in September 2018, or I guess 4 months later, in September 2018, the Center for Data and Society came out with this large-scale report talking about the alternate influencer network on YouTube. And the whole point of this document was to establish academically, in very heavy air quotes, that there was some credence to the legacy media folklore that YouTube radicalized people. So, this report, I read it, so you don't have to, is essentially a guilt by association web of 16 months of YouTube content for a handful of YouTube content creators. So they looked at Joe Rogan. I think they looked at Dave Rubin. They looked at a handful of other people, but they don't. Besides Rogan, they don't really say. They name drop some names to really freak you out, and then they do this. They do this web, right? And so you can draw a direct line from Joe Rogan to Tim Pool to Richard Spencer if you want to, or let's somebody else that's on the list that that really is sort of you could draw a direct line from Joe Rogan through Steven Crowder to Stefan Molyneux, right? And so those two particular people, Richard Spencer, Stefan Molyneux, are people whose opinions are not, I would say, not great.
Okay.
I certainly don't agree with them. I don't know. Stefan Molyneux is one of those race and IQ people.
Okay.
To
I'm not
sort of frame
sure the
it,
group, but yes.
In a little bit more specific terms. So I mean, it's an argument that I don't want to have, and I definitely don't want to litigate it here, but that's one of his things. In any event, so this was the academic basis, in heavy air quotes, for one of the YouTube apocalypses. And it's sort of now morphed into the Stamos quote from 2 weeks ago, where they're specifically calling out conservative YouTube people, not
I got a pause on Todd there, and so we'll have to let him finish his thought here in a second. Where I am not, like, come back to me, as he's talking about this connection, potentially between, I guess, kind of, hopefully he'll be right back. The idea that there is a concerted effort, a narrative, something being dropped. Hey, there he is. Now he's back. And so.
Oh, did I
paused
die?
For a moment. It paused, and I didn't have you for about 30 seconds there.
Okay. What was the last thing I said?
You were just talking about like the narrative or such as it was ending there. And
okay.
Then,
so there appears to me to be a very distinct asymmetry between what the legacy media, as well as the denizens of social media websites themselves, are interested in censoring, and what they're not interested in censoring.
Okay.
We'll get into this in a little bit more, but interestingly, it
happened again. What's happening? Is this on my end or is this on Todd's end? Because my stuff all looks happy, but it looks like he is getting hiccups again. This is going to be a challenge since we don't have Ken to balance us today in our conversation. So, all right. Shoot.
Did I die?
Yeah.
Did I die?
Yeah, it stopped again. Like that one was like after 10 seconds in, it hiccuped.
Okay. I'm closing down. So I can't change the video quality on the video in Twitch for some reason. So
just close the stream for that. See if that helps the hiccup.
Yeah. So I'm closing the stream to save some bits. Okay.
Gotcha.
So, I guess this is why it's important to me, because there's a very, it's what seems to be very clear delineation of smears that are allowed and smears that are not allowed, and misinformation that's allowed and misinformation that's not allowed.
Okay.
And I thought we should talk about it.
All right. So when you're talking about the information, like the comparison there of what's allowed, what's not, where are you seeing that delineation? What are you seeing that is allowed or not? And how do you see it being differently dealt with, I guess, to kind of set the stage for this being heavy-handed one way or maybe not another?
So there's a handful of American folklore. This is in the broader context, this is the so-called social media war on misinformation, right? So in this case, the misinformation that we're specifically talking about is the misinformation that somehow there was impropriety with the American elections in 2020, right?
Okay.
Of some variety. Okay. If we take that at its word, then if we assume, and the evidence would suggest that this assumption is perfectly valid, if we assume that the 2020 U.S. presidential election was good, then yes, any information that would say to the contrary would in fact be misinformation.
Okay,
fair enough. I understand that. However, there are lots and lots of misinformation that have been peddled at the highest levels of the U.S. media organization or the U.S. Mainstream media institutions, and nothing seems to be done about them. Really important organizations like the WHO have pushed out misinformation, and no one seems to care. And yet Newsmax, OAN, Alex Jones push out misinformation, and it's the worst thing ever, and we have to unperson these people from the internet, and cable companies shouldn't carry them anymore, right? So I have a screen cap of the tweet from the World Health Organization, January 14th, 2020. Preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus.
Okay, so
kind of tweet? Important.
Yep.
And completely false. Right?
Is it? Well, the question I'd have about that is, was it at the time it was stated false? Because it says preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities. So the report that the WHO got was, do we know that that report was, well, not that the report itself, that WHO knew differently than what the report stated?
I guess we don't. So to be charitable, it is possible that the Chinese Communist Party, right, the Chinese government,
I will admit that the Chinese government likely lied, right? Likely were putting out open propaganda to say, it ain't a big deal, we got this handled, don't look at us. I am very willing, based off a lot of factors, to believe that China would have created a narrative to diminish anything that would have left them more culpable to what happened and their actions.
Okay, so then the WHO is merely guilty of spreading the lie,
which is a concern.
That really originated with the Chinese Communist Party, as we said.
Well, and I bring this up because I think there's a very specific distinction to be stated. Is someone who is pressing information putting out information they know to be false, or are they susceptible to pushing out information because that's what they saw and they're trying to get things out there and thus being used as a conduit for misinformation? And I think there's a distinction there because there's a willful action versus being ignorant and taken advantage of, and thus you need to do better. But if there's a willful action of someone pushing misinformation they know is wrong, that I think falls into a different category than someone who posts information they thought to be true at the time that was false. And how, in both cases, they react to that after the fact, when more is known. I think there's a difference in the intent, I guess, on how information is being presented.
Okay. Then I would ask, do we then also sort of grade these things on a curve for how large the effects of the dissemination of the misinformation was?
I believe that can be a factor. I absolutely believe that is an important factor, in fact, because I think that talks very differently to the person who is, your uncle at a barbecue spouting ideals and thoughts that are contrary to what has been proven true because they feel a certain way about a subject, to someone of distinct authority and position telling the world that falsehoods are true and that fact is false. I think those are two very different levels of impact that should be judged accordingly.
Okay.
So I do think there is a curve or a difference in how you apply based on reach and impact.
Is it also true then that because InfoWars and OANN and Newsmax portray themselves as news, in terms of like production value and how the set looks and all of that
what they present and clear themselves as well as the potential access they have to individuals, like any group that is given access to the presidential brief, like room, to ask questions directly to the president in that limited space, likely is housed in a position of authority or dissemination that you are a major influencer, potentially, or network or such.
No, I'm trying to I'm trying to suss this out because I need to understand why the Newsmax, OANN, InfoWars lies are so terrible, but when the New York Times or CNN or MSNBC does it, it's okay.
Well, and that's where I think all of them. I think all of who you just presented are on the same level for influence and impact, and because they're all presenting themselves as arguably news organizations. Because I try to get away from the term media, because media, I believe, is way too broad, and I despise when organizations who are actively part of, and even more still broad, but somehow seems to be as a designator, mainstream compared to all media. But when you have major networks calling out other mainstream media as doing something off when they themselves are mainstream media or media as a whole, is so disingenuous it makes me sick. But that's a side piece. I do believe in this case all of them are equal in the sense of a news organization, as they claim. And I would say is something that was mentioned earlier, a huge difference from a Joe Rogan type of presenter who is not even tries, doesn't up front states, I am not news. It says, I am here for entertainment, to have conversations and to do things like that. Does he have a lot of influence? Yes. But does he present himself as a news network? Not at all. Does he get any of the benefits and protections and things that designate a news network gets? No. Because he is not a news network, right? And so I think there's a definite difference between just because someone has massive reach. And this is another thing, right? Even how you mentioned earlier about how there are YouTube channels that get more viewership during the middle of the day than what is considered an old school media source like a CNN or Fox News or an MSNBC or whomever or NPR or such like that, right? Those YouTube channels arguably in most cases, my opinion, most cases aren't even flipping close to news. They're almost all opinion. And yet they put this thin veneer of, but we cover the facts and it's opinion. Most of them have no credentials, have never been to any kind of journalism school, have never proved themselves in any form of true objective journalism. They just found a YouTube channel, put on a fun suit, and are able to opine in a professional way with some production value.
Right.
And somehow they are given credibility as being somehow news. And yet they're really just opining garbage. Now, you may agree with their opinions, or they may provide some level of balance, but I think all of them are on a whole different level than actual media networks and how we should look at them. But I think one of the challenges, and we may get into this about the impact of any of these, is that unfortunately, a lot of people look at these various sources that the internet provides us access to as being equal in what they present for level of fact versus level of opinion versus anything to determine between the two. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have today. And I'm going, I got to be careful. Sure. I'm so trying not to curse right now because of my opinion on some of them.
I'll tell you what, I'll talk for a while so that you don't curse. So Babs brings up something interesting in the chat. The New York Times does hold itself accountable for correction. Others don't. And my question to her is, does it matter? Right?
No, that's to him. But yeah.
When the New York Times and the rest of the media, the mainstream media apparatus in America decided to assassinate the character of the Covington High School kids, right? They printed the retraction, great, but everybody still thinks all those kids are bigots. And when BuzzFeed got caught in their lie, they doubled down on it. They went, those Covington High School kids painted their faces black. And what they really meant is they took like black paint and painted their faces black, but the connection that you were supposed to make is that those kids were wearing blackface.
Gotcha.
Well, they paint their faces black, but they also paint their faces red and blue and green and yellow and white because black is a color of paint. And sure, I guess if you really needed to do the gotcha on somebody, you could technically say they were in blackface, but my understanding is that kind of blackface and painting your face black, is the Great Muta, the professional wrestler, a bigot? Because he painted his face the same color of black.
It's the entire point of context in those situations. Was somebody painting their face black to portray themselves as symbolic of a group of people, thus black culture, black people, or were they painting it? But that's the thing. It's context. That's why it matters. It's context, because there is absolutely blackface that occurs. But if that specific issue was people doing it in a context that had nothing to do with representing a race or a group of people, then it has no issue. And yes, could it be portrayed wrong?
Game.
Well, that's the thing. I am only saying that because I don't know the context. I have not seen that. But I'm defending that if they weren't presenting themselves as black people in some form, then it's not blackface in the sense of a negative thing. If they were, then F them all, they're doing it wrong. I don't know. But that's where I'm just doing my personal designation between how color can be used as an effect.
Sure. No, I hear you. And just, again, full disclosure, if it really was true that these kids were painting their faces in order to try to imitate black folks, I would be right there with you. It's okay, we have to reevaluate whether or not, everybody was wrong about those kids in the first place.
Now, granted, if they were presenting that, like you're saying, is if a media outlet was presenting it and trying to make, and this is one of the big challenges we have today, some groups are really nefariously good at implying things, but doing it in a way that keeps them legally safe from what they're doing, right? Where they may, famously, there are organizations or groups, anyone can do it. We could do it if I put a banner on the screen, right? That could say one thing while the image being portrayed is something not the same. But when you see them together, you get the impression that that's the story, even if my words are saying otherwise. It's a very propaganda thing.
I have screen caps of that too. Relative to the conversation we're gonna have next week about Wall Street bets.
Okay.
Right. So it's on page 2 of the notes file, but the first one leads to a Yahoo.com, money.yahoo.com article that loosely ties somebody who is at a Stop the Steal protest to the Wall Street Bets subreddit, or at least implies it based on the Google search result. Like, I went to the article and I couldn't find that tie, but the Google search result, which is the screen cap that I grabbed, implies very heavily that somebody who is at a Stop the Vote protest is also active or says things online similarly to the Wall Street Bets people. Okay,
see, that is interesting, just because I know, while I have not followed it directly, when I started doing I heard about it before it was mentioned by you, and seeing some other discussions that other people brought it up to me, that in the past, prior to potentially this last week's activities, a generalization of Wall Street's bets has often portrayed it as being a very heavily conservative, what often gets described as alt-right type of base of people involved in that Reddit, basically, in that group.
And so I did a little looking, and for at least the last 2 or 3 days, it's all been memes. Like, it's all memes, the hedge fund people getting crushed.
Yeah.
So like, I even did a string search for Stop the Steal relative to Wall Street Bets, and there couldn't find any search results for the entire life of the subreddit.
Okay. Well, right? That's the thing.
So I'm gonna read what's in the screen cap real quick.
Yep.
So it's from money.yahoo.com, and the headline is "Meet the right-wing extremists behind Stop the Steal protests." 7 November 2020, and then they give you a little blurb of the article.
Yep.
And it says exactly this: Alexander appears to be affiliated with Stop the Vote through his ... to the actions of users on the Wall Street Bets subreddit and the subsequent ... Okay.
So, okay.
If you are casually looking this up, and you just read that, as I did, you would have a connection in your mind that would lead you to believe that Stop the Vote protesters and Wall Street Bets are affiliated in some way.
Yeah, no, I agree that reading those, because you're seeing two especially bolded terms in that statement, which are Stop the Vote and Wall Street Bets, that are two very specifically bolded terms in it. Because I will admit, don't understand how this works in general terms of what gets concatenated, what gets shortened, if it's algorithmic or if it's specifically a person making choices. I don't know, because I know when it's like an actual news site doing specific things, but I've known, like in our own cases, right? If I posted on WordPress on our actual Versus the World production site, long articles, a piece of it just goes whoop, and you get some length of it. And I had never taken the time to manipulate that so that what you see as the blurb is relevant. It's just like, yep, wherever it cut it, because I know there are algorithms that do that by default. Now, I would hope bigger sites do more manual curation, at which point you run into this potential of people really choosing how to present that information. And unfortunately, that seems to often present a narrative that...
Okay, so that article was from 7 November 2020. Here's the second blurb from a Facebook post this morning about Wall Street Bets. Okay?
Was the Facebook post from where? I don't see the attribution to the post.
One of my friends, one of the people that's on my friends list shared it. Okay. So it was a share of a post by someone else on Facebook.
Okay, so an opine about it. Okay.
An opine about it. Here's the quote. These aren't a bunch of Antifa thugs or lazy Occupy Wall Street millennials either. Some are, but the place this all started was previously a den of Stop the Vote pro-Trump goofballs.
Okay.
Right? Okay. So we have a direct we have a direct line. There's I can't say for sure whether or not the person who made the Facebook post this morning read the article from 7 November.
Yeah,
right?
But you have seen where some amount of information has allowed this person to form this opinion that seems to be a relevant, is different from the previous.
Well, and so I had to invent a term for this stuff, and I think I'm going to call it media folklore. Because there appears not to be, like, I did some searching on Reddit this morning and couldn't find any Stop the Steal related post on Wall Street Bets at all.
Okay.
Now, it's certainly possible that that the Wall Street Bets mods went in after Election Day and cleaned all that up, right? Like, that is inside the realm of possibility. But I kind of doubt it.
Well, and I think that other systems like
mods, like most mods, they do it for free. And who's going to spend that kind of time to go through the entire post history? Or, this is a subreddit with over 1 million users.
Well, admittedly,
are you really going to go through months of posts to like?
It wouldn't
try
be
and
hard.
Find...
All you have to do is you just do that same search, and then you just close any thread that has it. You just scrub any thread that. Well, I say this because I recently fell victim to a scheme on Facebook of a retweet this thing kind of thing. And once I realized someone called it out and did a little more look and saw the actual source of it, I saw this is garbage. And I spent the next 2 hours trying to clean up my mess. Because I was like, oh, don't want that to continue out there. That's not who I want to be. But anyhow, I can see it being done, especially if you actually truly believe in your thing. Because if I would do it on our show, when I get posts every once in a while on our YouTube archives, and it's ad bait BS or people opining in a way that has nothing relevant to the show, just trying to make noise, I'll delete those because it doesn't add any benefit. I'm happy for active discourse that disagrees with us, but when you post something that is basically come buy this from me because you might have people who will see this post here, you have no place on our YouTube channel, right? You have no place on our Twitch channel. I'm going to get rid of you. And so, I do that. I curate to some degree.
Okay.
So
fair enough.
It could happen, but no, even then, you're right. I'm not going to assume that happened. So, but you do see that somebody has now posted an opinion that is very different from what was a general consensus or some feeling about it back in November. That they're trying to state that what's actively happening around the short stock piece is potentially a whole different group of people or something.
So, and this is especially pervasive amongst media types, and especially media types that are active on Twitter, to associate anybody they don't like with the alt-right or provide one of the critical theory-ist or isms.
To be fair, or with Antifa.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, because depending on your source you're looking at, the big, I don't know the right term of it, bugaloo, right? The groups that are targeted as being the extremes that often will trigger or cause a lot of preloaded assumption if they're mentioned will be things like alt-right, Proud Boys, something like that, as groups that have nefarious overtones, to what has also been created on the other side of like Antifa and other groups, perhaps BLM and stuff like that, where even if there's not a true association, bringing it up as even the idea of a possibility already assesses a huge level of background and assumption on a person's mind. And it's being used as a tool, right? It's being used to adjust a person's opinion about what's happening because I tied that together, even if the tie doesn't truly exist.
Yep. Fair. Yeah. Yeah. No, I gotcha. I have not seen nearly as many of the associations to Antifa as I have the alt-right. But I think in part of that is because,
oh man, you should see my social
of
media feeds.
because of the content circle that I travel in, and I'm not on Twitter at all. Like when I see tweets at all, it's because somebody else shows them to me.
For the most part, agreed.
So,
same. I'm on Twitter very lightly because I don't find
Yeah.
a lot of value from it, other than personal
Sure.
connections on Twitter. Yeah.
Right, but you know, when Rogan made the transition to Spotify, suddenly there was this big upheaval because he's had Dr. Deborah on his show a couple of times, and he had a lady who is a journalist for, I want to say New York Times, but who wrote a book about kids who had
the influence
activists
of
push them to transition and then later regretted the decision that they'd made.
Yep.
Like she went and found a whole slew of people and interviewed them and so on and so forth. And because Joe Rogan even talked to these people, the Joe Rogan podcast is suddenly transphobic. And Spotify is transphobic for hosting the Joe Rogan show.
Okay, now, but you say that. It's my challenge is there are groups of extreme views on every side of issues. And I say this in the sense that I see articles posted by people that have specific leanings about their views of the world and tend to only post opine pieces from sites that generally have a very specific viewpoint and create a narrative that it seems like many people must believe that way. And so when you say that like Joe Rogan podcast getting, labeled as, I would counter or at least argue to the degree that in very specific groups that try to make very specific pushes against everyone they can has been labeled as such. But I would argue that in the grand majority of view of the world has not been affected. And I think that arguably from Joe Rogan, you can see that based on his numbers alone, that the influence of those handful of very vocal people have is almost nil. So yes, has Joe Rogan been criticized as perhaps leaning a certain direction in his political views and thus participating in conversations with people that hold views that a lot of people in those very vocal minority groups disagree with, and they try to make it a big issue? I've seen it, absolutely. Do I believe they've actually had an impact with it? No. So, but on the other side, it's the same thing as I've seen some very strong, what could be described as alt-right groups or people with very conservative viewpoints in what they showcase constantly, literally state that the insurrection that happened at the U.S. Capitol was projected by Antifa and had nothing to do with anyone who supports. But I'm saying I've seen the same amount of volume, and from people who I would arguably say are intelligent people who work in my field, keep pushing this narrative that's equally absurd and I would say disgusting, in my opinion, and gets the same level of viewpoints from that side. So I've seen it from both ends and try to criticize it equally to be like, y'all full of crap and y'all equally full of crap. But I will say that I have absolutely seen that narrative push both ways, and I don't personally believe that when you hear those smaller groups yell very loudly, that is actually representative of the general opinion of society and the world. But that's a problem, right? The most people in the world don't make noise. It's small groups who are very opinionated about what they care about who make all the noise and make it seem like the whole world must agree with them. And I think,
all right, Ken. In the chat, there's a major difference between hosting someone to debate them on issues and hear viewpoints all around and hosting someone to give them a platform without opposing discussion. Joe Rogan is ill-equipped intellectually, and he'd be the first person to admit this, to oppose anyone who's an expert on any topic besides MMA.
Yeah, what he has expertise in.
Right? I mean, so he doesn't, while it's true, he doesn't take an adversarial stance against somebody like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro or Sam Harris or Deborah or Bret and Eric Weistein, right? He's never taken an opposing or an adversarial stance against them. He doesn't take an adversarial stance against Abby Martin or Kyle Kalinske or Jimmy Dore or Bernie Sanders when he had him on the show. And then, I mean, part of that is because Rogan agrees with most of what Bernie believes in from a policy perspective, which shows you exactly how alt-right he is. Besides the fact that mere minutes after California legalized recreational marijuana use, he was smoking a joint. Right. And it's not right. The whole point of the Rogan podcast is to not be a debate show. Like that show would be worse as a debate show.
Well, potentially,
the point of his show is to have that show would be worse if it was a debate, because it'd just be the two sides shouting at each other. And I don't want to hear that for 3 hours. I want to hear Rogan have a conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I want that conversation to start with organic chemistry having to do with mushrooms and weed, and end with Area 51. Right? And where that conversation is going to go, I have no idea. Right? Fantastic. That's why they're awesome, because I don't know where they're going to go. I don't know. I know that if Rogan does have a agenda going into these things, he hides it pretty well. Right? So he's just talking to people.
Yeah, no, and I agree. But that's where I say
we need more of that, not less.
Well, we need things framed appropriately, right? And so I will say that, because I have definitely seen conversations Joe Rogan has had that pissed me off because he allowed people to spout obvious falsehoods with no challenge. And it's like, man, you're letting him push this narrative that is straight factually garbage. That's your show, but it meant I felt less of the conversation being presented, because I was like, you're not getting to any depth. You're just letting this person continue to spout and not even challenge it. Like, wait, that thing you said seems based on almost nothing. Sure. Could you explain it further? Because even if he didn't really dig into them and counter them, but just said, like, could you give me more on that? He just lets some things slide to the point where it's like, holy cow, you're giving them a platform of propaganda. And so I've had challenges with some of his shows. In general, I think he is fine, and how he chooses to have his guests and stuff like that. But a big part of that, again, I'll push, is that Joe Rogan is not a news broadcast. And is very different from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, RT, all these other networks and stuff that are out there. New York Times, Washington Post.
Yep. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Well, and really.
Oh, that's a tip that came in from Where's My Pros At?
Nice.
I was like, I'm hearing big sounds.
Thank you, Ken. I coined a phrase a little bit ago before we fell down this Joe Rogan hole.
Yeah, media folklore is what I heard you say.
That I'm going to call media folklore. And I want to give you the most benign piece of media folklore that I could think of when I was putting together the notes for this show. And that is the fact that wealth inequality is a direct result of deregulation under Reagan.
Okay.
Right? Again, I saw a Facebook post from an author that one of my friends, shared, and then made the comment that this is really basically how I feel things have gone down. And it's like, the yawning wealth inequality started in the 1980s with deregulation under Reagan. And if you look at any of the data, if you really believe that, you have an 8-year period to explain to me. Because yawning wealth inequality started in 1973. So if you're really going to lay this at the feet of deregulation under Reagan, then you have to explain what happened between 1983 and 1981. In which, because wage growth flattened out totally in 1973, and GDP growth, which is an indicator of the
is this the
capital
productivity and real income graph?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So just so I can put it up there. Yep.
Sure. No, that's important for people to have context of that. But it's folklore now that that the yawning wealth inequality that we see today is a result of Reagan. And you can see very clearly, and by the way, this is not to say that anything that happened policy-wise between 1980 and today hasn't exacerbated the problem. That's obviously true, right? But if you really think that rolling back or re-regulating industries that were deregulated in the 80s is suddenly going to fix wealth inequality, you're nuts. Or you believe a lie. Or you don't understand what this graph is telling you.
So if your argument is that the deregulation is somehow or regulation/deregulation somehow tied to the amount of growth of profit and different income and things, okay.
So,
but I personally feel like those two things have nothing to do with each other. I think regulation is more about not poisoning my damn water, you filthy companies that are just doing whatever you can for profit. And I'm okay with regulation from a government perspective that has teeth to keep them from destroying my planet, my water supply, completely nerfing the ability for competitive resources, monopolization, and things like that, which is where I think regulation's kind of good. And I'm very against the true libertarian viewpoint of don't regulate anything. Personally.
And again, that's a perfectly valid reasoning to have, and I share it, by the by. But to explain the graph, the purple line, major sector productivity, is essentially capital share of total growth, right?
Okay.
So if you think that if you're thinking about, say, GDP grows at 2.5% per year, right? And it's actually more than that, but whatever. That's that purple line, okay? The two green lines are labor share of total growth. And you can see that the purple line has gone way, way up, and the green lines are flat. And that is the measure of wealth inequality. And if you look at the graph, they're in lockstep, the purple line and the green lines. And there's a better graph than this that goes, the green lines go farther back than 65. You can trace this back all the way back to World War II. And from the period of 1945 to about 1972 or 3, wage growth and GDP growth, which is wage growth is a measure of how much of total growth goes to labor, and the purple line, major sector productivity, is a measure of how much of total growth goes to capital or to management or to corporations or to rich people, like however you want to, whatever shorthand you want to use to describe that. And you can plainly see by 1975, it's already starting.
Well, and the thing I would challenge, because like I said, I don't believe that Reaganomics was changing the trend of where it's going. I would argue Reaganomics changed which companies were getting the money, and it focused heavily on big corporations than small business, where small businesses basically got effed hard by Reaganomics, where big corporations benefited. But I would say that what you're talking to about the actual what I'm talking about, the actual difference in profit and stuff like that, or money coming around. One of the things I tie to more about is that we don't see a big increase in wages across any of this, which isn't a policy thing so much as, again, minimum income or minimum wages haven't gone up, all those kind of things. But what ties to me more is that the actual inequality of wealth in our nation, I see is more tied to, and people are going to hate me for this the taxation on the wealthy, because everything I've looked at is back when we were in our heyday, going into the 70s, before it started hitting the 80s change, the rich were taxed as high as 90%. Right? That the average of the wealthy was in the 70s. And that somehow this narrative that we can't tax the wealthy and it will keep and drive business away. Talk about media folklore. One of the most falsehoods I've ever seen is that if we tax the wealthy appropriately, that they're going to leave. That's BS to an infinite degree. Well, and that's the bigger bigger issue there.
Sure, but there's an asterisk to that 90% number, which is nobody paid that.
Not true. Not true. Back in the 70s, 60s and 70s when it's done, this was the effective actual tax rate, not just what the number was. So not like today where the effective tax rate for the wealthy is almost zero. The effective tax rate of the wealthy back in the 70s was higher than 70% because they didn't have as many ways to dodge and broke it that were happening in the 80s and 90s. So we actually taxed the rich 70-90% of their income. We actually did that at a point at the highest growth in the U.S. And that gets lost and BS'd so bad.
No, 70% I'll give you. No one paid almost no one paid the 90%.
Well, you also didn't have as many hyper wealthy back then.
Few people paid the 90% rate. Also, very few people paid zero. And most people paid about between 30 and 35. And that was how we funded the government for years and years and years.
And it was actually working. And that disparity has gotten bigger and bigger over time along with this graph.
So we're almost to the break. Babs is challenged. This isn't a news source. Why am I talking about this? This is misinformation, right? This is something that is, we have data. It is provably wrong what's being said about the sources of yawning wealth inequality in America. It's on Facebook. And no one's getting banned over it.
Okay, so that is an important piece to bring up because the next discussion we're going to have after the break is about when information is arguably or objectively proven to be false, how that is handled, how the reaction of that is, and how we've been seeing it happen and what do we think needs to happen or should or shouldn't. So we will get into that after the break, but think about that over this about that information can be proven false and is shared online and how it's being either let live or somehow caused to not. And we'll discuss that after the break. With that, we're going to take about a 3.5 minute break here, a little under. And we're going to play a song from, of course, OC Remix, because thank you guys for remixing music that makes it non-challengeable on the, what's legal, what's not to broadcast. This one, because I feel like there's a good conversation happening, is a remix from Outset Initiative on Super Smash Bros. Melee called Choose Your Character Versus. And so we'll play this song. We'll be back right after this. Take your time, refresh your cups, use a bio, whatever's necessary, and we'll be back right after this.
listening to ShowX on VtWProductions.com.
All right, everybody, and welcome back to the show. Just before the break, we were talking about how, with the impact and observance of things that are objectively not true, can get shared out there through various sources, and what the potential fallout is, and what's going on with that. And so, one of the things Todd had just brought up was the idea that when misinformation or something false gets pressed online in some form, what's the fallout? And why potentially is that fallout, not equitable, essentially? Why, in some cases, may you see something reacted to in one way that you don't see it reacted to in the same way elsewhere? So, to form that, Todd, what were you were presenting some examples?
So there's in my mind, a perceived asymmetry, right? And this whole thing started with Alex Jones getting unpersoned from the internet, right?
Okay.
And you can say that that's justified and that's fine, but then there are other things that, in my opinion, are worse.
Okay.
And that no one is getting banned for, that no one is having any repercussions whatsoever for.
Okay, can you give an example? I know that Alex Jones was essentially minimized in many ways. I don't know the specifics of what his deplatforming ended up being because I don't follow him.
Anyone, he basically said, the thing that did it, I believe, was saying that the Sandy Hook parents were crisis actors.
Okay.
And that none of that was real, and that it was a plot to it was a plot. PSYOPs plot to strip the Second Amendment out of the Constitution or something along that. It's not like I watch the guy. I don't necessarily like him. I think when he's smoking pot, he's funny as hell. And if he had framed his show in the context of a professional wrestling promo, I think he would be fine, instead of saying that this is news, right? So the framing, as we talked about earlier, the framing has a lot to do with this. So I don't want anybody out there to think that that I'm trying to defend Alex Jones. I'm really not. What I'm defending is the principle that we shouldn't pick and choose which misinformations we're going to drop the hammer on and which misinformations we're not. Okay, so I'm just framing the discussion in that way. So
okay,
inside that framework. Okay, so Alex Jones gets unpersoned for saying that the Sandy Hook parents are crisis actors. Disgusting, and he got thrown off of every major social media site for it. Okay. So I'm looking at and I guess I'll put this in the chat. This is a link to a press release, I guess, from the Senate Judiciary Committee, talking about the veracity of the Steele dossier. And for those of you that don't know, the Steele dossier is what the Obama administration used with the FISA court to get the warrants to spy on the Trump campaign in 2016. Okay. It's and the warrants through the FISA court to spy on the Trump campaign is what led to the Russia, I don't know what you call it. Some would say conspiracy theory. I'm not sure where I fall on that. But the Mueller report seemed to indicate that there was not direct collusion, but potentially obstruction with the investigation after the fact. So in any event, okay. So given all of that, we had 3 years of content on MSNBC, and more specifically the Rachel Maddow show, in which she peddled this narrative for 3 years, and was at one point the second or maybe the most popular show on cable news for a long time, peddling misinformation.
Okay.
Right? You could have probably told the truth about the obstruction story had it been 100% true, and have it been just as bad. Right? And nothing has. She has suffered no repercussions whatsoever from peddling that misinformation for 3 years, from right after the 2016 election up until the point that the Mueller report came out.
Okay.
Yeah. So if Alex Jones's misinformation is so terrible that we have to unperson him off the internet for it, doesn't the duration and the topic and doesn't that misinformation, isn't that worse? I don't understand how we grade these things to say, you know what, you can't be on YouTube, you can't be on Twitter, you can't be on Facebook. You have to go to all the alternate places where almost nobody goes. But you, MSNBC contributor, you're fine. And so that's an example.
Okay.
Of
so I admittedly
asymmetry.
I admittedly do not watch Rachel Maddow. Don't care about her personally, so I don't have much context to what she was saying and how the impact was. I am curious. I was trying to look up, but I can't find a direct comment on whether or not Rachel Maddow is considered a news broadcast or a opine show. And I say that because that is one of every news network's get out of jail free card. It's what keeps Tucker Carlson on the air somehow. When a judge legally stated that no reasonable person would ever believe anything he says is true. And yet he is allowed to, a judge ruled that because that was Fox's defense for libel in their own cases. They argued Fox News argued that Tucker Carlson is not news. Nobody should ever believe him because otherwise they would have been basically shut off the air. They had to argue that. And yet people still go to him as though what he states is fact and news, which is a big challenge on what's going on.
No,
but so with Rachel Maddow, I don't know where she falls in that line. So legally, right, if she's an opine show, she can unfortunately say anything she damn well wants. So if she's a news show, I would argue that there should be repercussions and have to have fallout for stating falsehoods. Now, and I will also say that on all the broadcast centers, they play the games of legality so damn well because they will use very specific terms about, we are just stating what is being reported over here, thus completely abolishing their legal recourse to what's happening and saying we're just talking about the thing that's being talked about. And on the other side,
that's the problem. Okay. Right, and that's the problem. I totally agree with you. My suspicion is, and I don't know, but my suspicion is if MSNBC were ever challenged in court, they would say that Rachel Maddow is just an opinion show, and therefore nobody should look upon that as news. But here's the problem. Like we showed earlier with this whole stop the vote alt-right tie to Wall Street bets, it only takes one. Or the assassinating of the Covington High School kids, right? It only takes one or two. I'll give you one that's a little bit less drowned in current events. This idea that esports is sexist somehow.
Okay.
Because there are no girls in any of the top, say, League of Legends leagues. Or there are only, like 3 years ago, there were none. that the Overwatch League and Kotaku actually, Nate Grayson, and this is where we put the disclaimer, if I name a name, do not engage with those people.
We're not asking for anyone to call out or do anything.
No, unfortunately, my favorite gimmick from the old show, Threadjack, couldn't possibly do now.
That would be
right.
Odd. Yeah,
I'd like that. Is just we would become public enemy number one for targeted harassment.
Yeah.
Which kind of sucks, but whatever. Anyway, so Nate Grayson writes the article that the Overwatch League is sexist because there's this one girl in Korea that didn't get drafted by any of the teams, right? So you probably don't remember this. I do, because I have a photographic memory and I hate this culture warrior crap. But she got on a team. Right? The Shanghai Dragons started 0-8, and they brought her on, and then they went 0-33 after that. So, from the perspective of a totally left-handed compliment, she totally deserved to be in the Overwatch League because she wasn't any better or worse than any of the other losers on the
There's a
Shanghai
whole
Dragons
conversation about whether people try to force a narrative because of what they're trying to produce. And in that case, it's one of those, if you're not good enough, you're not good enough. And the top players and top teams are going to get whoever's the best talent. So I disagree with the narrative of what they're trying to say. Nate
Grayson wasn't forced to write the goddamn follow-up, which was the Shanghai Dragons were 0-8 without her and 0-33 with her. And by the way, if you factor in Victus esports, and Team Siren, girls in professional video gaming are something like 0-70. Right?
I got you.
By the way, I don't say this because I'm happy about it. I'm saying this because instead of writing the commentary that says that esports is sexist, you write the commentary that says, hey, maybe esports should have women leagues too. Like real sports.
I can see that conversation. I could also see, for me, probably the bigger conversation of maybe it's time we do more to focus on how everyone's a gamer and it's not a gender-based thing. All the way back to the false narrative. Well, all the way back to the false narrative of Gamergate, that all gamers are misogynistic, basement-dwelling, in their parents' home kind of thing, right? Let's acknowledge what actual gamers are, who they are, and maybe celebrate it in a way that it's okay for gals to game and not be negatively hit. Just like it's okay for gals to be part of STEM. Let's talk about it's okay for gals to also game, to also do all the things guys do, and stop negatively pushing it.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Remember James Damore?
Not specifically. You'll talk about the action I made.
James Damore was the Google engineer that after diversity training.
Yep.
Wrote the big memo that cited psychometric research relative to big five personality traits. And the premise of that memo was, well, if you want more women in STEM leadership positions, why don't you make the positions more attractive to women?
Right.
Oh,
no, that's... It's a challenge because if you point out that there perhaps is actual differences between sexes, that allows a large group of very vocal people to say they disagree, and unfortunately that has become a somewhat protected viewpoint that if you disagree with it, you are likely going to be fighting an uphill battle. If you're really, because it's difference between equality and equity, right? What it means to give people equal chances, what it means to actually work towards a more equal outcome, things like that. There's a lot of discussion we had there. When we're talking right now about the outcomes of things, because I want to bring us back to where we were going into about censorship or the perception of censorship.
Can I just finish the GG point real quick?
Please do.
GG was one of the first times that the alt-right smear was used against people. And that had to do with the fact that Adam Baldwin, in the very, very early days, like this was in the weeks after the that was like Labor Day weekend 2014, when 14 articles were written in the same day saying that you didn't need gamers to be in your audience, and gamers were bad.
There's a whole nother conversation, yes, about what Gamergate and what it was, because I still hear the fallout. Yeah.
Well, and I don't want to relitigate that either, but one of the things, because I was paying attention to this stuff, one of the things was used is suddenly everybody who is not instantaneously and vociferously against any part of the consumer revolt was alt-right.
Interesting.
Yep. And so, to my recollection, that was one of the first times. I didn't even realize at that time, at August, September 2014, I didn't even know what the term was.
Okay.
Like, apparently the term originated in 2007 or 2008, but I had never heard it before September 2014.
Okay. Well, and I don't think I was following it at any of that time frame.
Right?
Well, and you're right. I don't want to get too far back into the Gamergate thing, because we've had a few shows on it in the past, and we lived through it because we were broadcasting during it as gamers. Well, and it still comes up on occasion to me, where I tend to be on the opposite side of what a carrying narrative tends to be about the effects of it, because I remember being there for it, and often will defend Total Biscuit and stuff that he was talking about at the time, since he got blasted hard on it. But when we come back to, like,
by the way. Oh, sorry. No, let's go on. We're gonna
when we get back, when we get back to, like, what we're seeing online and social media, what we've seen is some direct effects of, like you were mentioning, Todd. There have been actual actions taken place against some people. We have seen Alex Jones, like you mentioned, basically deplatformed. We've also seen, most recently, former President Trump completely delisted from various social media services and things out there, various ways of outreach. I actually want to step it back to a degree, because those are some of those extremes of the after effects of things, to where I saw a lot of this narrative being pressed initially, and that is the initiation of essentially fact checks, labeling, and things on posts that were coming through on social media, mostly from what I saw on Twitter and on Facebook as the two primaries, of how I would see direct action taken around various posts and things being shared. From my perspective, I guess to jump on this ahead of the conversation, is that what I witnessed was a lot of points being made or things being shared that, from what I watched, actually, the congressional hearings with the social media providers, with the CEOs of Facebook, Instagram, all those. I watched a lot of that, almost all of it, as well as following stuff online, because I was really curious about their response to it and what the elected representatives, senators, and stuff were trying to ask versus what they were presenting, and my own big watch of the disconnect between what knowledge there is in our elected officials about how technology works and what the state of things is. Serious issues with who we have up there. But essentially what I saw is that there was a reaction to what was being presented in these media things, where a problem was perceived that a lot of, as you talked about, misinformation was being pressed heavily, especially around politics and things that were coming up on elections and things like that. And the social media platforms that allow that this was happening on were put into a position where a lot of people were calling for them to take some kind of action. That all the way back to early, because a major platform for the former president was Twitter in reaching out to things, in that it seemed like he had a preference for tweeting something on his own personal account than holding an official press brief or something like that, and thus was constantly pushing out information, and had over many times presented information that was objectively false or was connected to groups and types of viewpoints that were demonstrably racist and things like that. And the challenge was that over the years, and actually I found an article talking about from Slate.com talking about social media and fact checking and their opinion that it by itself is not censorship, and essentially talks about the history of how much leniency was given to specifically the former president, as well as some very vocal opine type members to what are the guidelines already posted in social media by Twitter and by Facebook, that they objectively went against the terms of service essentially in their agreements years ago. But these social media companies basically were very fluid with how they presented or how they basically chose to either stop or not the posts that were coming out. And that over the time, they basically deferred to, these are public figures, they need to have their voice heard even if it's not true. And did that for years until just in recent time, they got to a point where they felt, and I would argue from a financial perspective, that it was not in the best interest of their brand to allow them to continue to go against the terms of service, and thus started implementing actions against. And the initial actions, what I witnessed was they, instead of actually delisting, taking off, stopping posts, they started by reaching out to some groups that they considered trusted as fact checkers, sites that had objectively tried to be that for quite some time prior to just being hit by these companies as a source. Things like, was it? I don't know if Fact or Fiction is one or not, but factcheck.org and, there's several sites that do it, that try to be fact check sites. They started using them as sources that had been doing it for some time versus trying to build their own to simply provide context to things that were being posted that had already been through those filters of fact checking to say specifically, this is not true. It also came up in a few cases, though, where it say this is true. And that was basically, I think, from what I heard the CEOs talking about, it was about the algorithms, the way things would spike in intensity. So that when a story would be shared, and then it started being shared more rapidly and faster and faster and faster and got a certain level of outreach and uptick, regardless of the source, if it suddenly bloomed, they would now apply this filter to it of, is this fact or fiction, basically. And it was a call out that they were, if not doing something, they were actively working in favor of all of these types of things that are considered egregious, like hate speech, inciting of violence, things like that, that they were, the classic thing, if you're not actively speaking out, it means you must be in support of, and discussion about whether that's true or not. But there's a level of, they were being accused essentially, like, you are allowing these horrific things to exist on your service. What are you going to do? If you're not doing something, you support it. And thus they, at some point, I'm sure, be a stockholder meeting or something, decided it was in their brand's best interest to maintain access to people and not be themselves, have people rush away from them to implement something. And man, if in my opinion, they didn't do it in the most light-hearted way possible, as long as they could, to say, look, we're doing something, before they were essentially pushed to a point of, okay, now we have to go steps further and start taking down articles that were inflammatory and beyond just fact or fiction, to finally, when people showed arguably a consistent, like, just, we're not going to pay attention to your terms, they're like, fine, then we're going to remove you because you have done this so often, so consistently, there's nothing else we can do to stop you, and it is hurtful to our brand to keep you here. And I bring it up that way about brand, especially because social media, for those who don't realize, is not covered by the First Amendment in the United States, because these are private organizations and companies doing things, not the government, choosing whether or not you have a platform to say what you want. The First Amendment allows anyone, and I've witnessed it, to go sit on the steps of the Capitol building or monuments and stuff around D.C. and spout whatever filth they choose. Happens constantly, and it's annoying as hell. However, almost every program you ever use online has a terms of service, and every one of them as a company can choose whether or not they allow you to continue using their service because you may hurt their brand. And so these private organizations, and I heavily argue this for anyone who claims to be capitalist focused about let the market do its thing should at the same time be huge about supporting company rights to delist people and not service who they don't want to. No shoes, no shirt, no service applies to no hate speech, no racism, no whatever. Get off my platform. It's the same damn law, essentially. And so it bothers me because what I saw was this narrative that people with, most often I saw conservative viewpoints, claiming that they were being unduly targeted by these algorithms, by these senses of things that were looking to place simply a label on them of whether things were proven by these sources they used to be false. And they claimed that that was censorship. And I argue it's not. It's highlighting that something you're posting has been proven by this group that are assumed to be experts at it to be false. Not that you couldn't share it, but that we're going to advise people that if they read this, hey, by the way, these sites that we refer to have reasons to believe that this information is not true. Okay. And I don't understand how they can claim that that's censorship when it's like, no, it's just a fact check. And I have, and this is one of those arguments I've also seen, they're only fact checking this side. Not true. I've seen the fact checks applied both ends of people doing radical viewpoints that are very not true, that are demonstrably not true. And the challenge, I would say, why it may feel, why there may be a perception that one side in the argument was being fact-checked more often and in some cases delisted when they went beyond terms of service to an extreme, it's because that group demonstrably, like you can go look up the number of posts they were pushing that were inaccurate, was significantly higher than groups that were pushing other opinions that were inaccurate. The percentage, the flow, the amount of posts that were happening were significantly higher on one side of the arguments politically in this last cycle than they were on the other, of pushing like false narratives and fake all kinds of nonsense that were done to sow these seeds of misinformation and to obscure fact. And I could trace back to several examples I saw where it was being done with the perspective of propaganda to sow those seeds of distrust in processes and people involved, that was being done with a purpose that get people to act in a certain way. It was manipulation. And so, yes, I can absolutely understand why companies would look at their platform and say, oh, look at you are weaponizing my system. I am going to not allow you to do that any further. Now, when I say the thing at the forefront of my conversation about what I saw described by the CEOs, and not just one group but multiple, about how they were applying it, is that people brought up one-off examples or other examples of people saying, kind of like you had mentioned, Todd, earlier, that there are groups that say equally harmful things that don't look like they were treated equally. But what I witnessed in that is their outreach, their impact, how often they do it, was so much less than the people that did get affected, that if it is algorithmically driven as to what comes up to a point where people have to react and actually do some kind of specific mitigation, most of those never reached that level. And so when there may be a difference in how it was applied, you're right, it may be, because I understand when our videos get listed on YouTube as having song information and stuff that's not necessarily within our rights to play, and I have to go comment the ones that we do have the rights to, like from Edifice and other groups have given us permission, and I have to go respond to the legal claim that is auto-generated because of algorithms, or else our video gets delisted. I have to do that. But you know what? That's because YouTube generates more content in a day than is physically possible for the majority of humanity to witness, to watch. So the ability for a person to curate that much data, I don't think is possible. On Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, I don't think a group of humans is large enough to curate that content.
I don't know. 24 million, or what is it? What's unemployment now? 7%? 20 million unemployed people out there right now.
Could people hire
Google
more? Have they been doing it? Yes. And the groups
Google
showed
and
that.
Facebook takes 80 cents out of every advertising dollar in the online space, so there's more than enough money.
There's money out there, and it's funny, but it's funny because that did come up in the congressional hearings, and the company said we have now added this many more curators. And they arguably showed they were spending millions more per year just on the effort to try to curate better. Because that was something that Congress brought up and said, well, why don't you just do and hire more people? And they're like, we have. And here's the amount of petabytes of data that we have to go through in a month.
Yeah.
And we can't. And so they discussed their algorithms, and they discussed how much effort they're putting into continuing to revise their algorithms. Because I argued anybody who's ever created an AI, an algorithm, a tool, did you get it perfect the first time? Did
of course not.
Anything ever change in your data set that caused you to have to patch, revise, or do something new to address the new reality? Right?
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
100%. No, Babs has nailed a couple of things in the chat, but I want you to finish your point first. It's
in general that because I've seen so much narrative come out because I do maintain some people that, in my opinion, provide some extremely ill-informed viewpoints where as much as they are intelligent engineers, it seems like all they do is retweet, reshare some of the most ridiculous, in my mind, viewpoints. And they hide behind the fact that the cyclic argument that I see some media sources make that pisses me off more than most, people are saying this. Yeah, but the people who are saying it are you 5 minutes earlier.
Yeah.
It's not an actual news story. You're full of crap. You're making it sound like you have a legitimate conversation, and it's bullshit, right? It's cyclic.
That was the point that I made a little while ago, right? It only takes one person or one group to say something temporarily incorrect.
Okay.
And that it gets legs, and then it shows up on social media, and then it really gets legs, especially for the groups of people that want whatever the incorrect or whatever the misinformation is to be true.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, the attachment rate's ridiculous.
Babs has hit it. Has somewhat hit it. Social media became the news source for much of America, so now outside forces threaten to make social media sites accountable for the accuracy of the content. We have to place blame, place responsibility, acknowledge the fact that all of the mainstream media in probably both America and the UK, at least, if not more places, have taken the Fox News business model of targeting a specific audience and dominating that specific audience instead of targeting everybody and trying to get as many people as possible. And even news sources that 6, 8, 10, 12 months ago I would have told you that I trusted, like Axios. I think even Axios has sort of done the research to identify what their niche is and is now targeting the niche.
Okay.
Right? And all of these websites do that. MSNBC is the equal and opposite of Fox News in that regard. Right?
I agree.
Find me the Washington Post op-ed writer who's going to argue that Amazon employees should organize. And you're not going to that's not going to happen. In part because nobody in organized labor is reading the Washington Post. There are probably a few, because there are probably some government employees that are in a union, but by and large, you're not going to get a bunch of Teamsters reading the Washington Post. You're just not. So I think we have to give credit where it's due. I think because of that business model, people are thirsting for alternate sources that give either comfort to the anxieties that they're feeling,
okay,
or what they perceive to be a better representation of fact or truth.
I do agree that I think people are thirsting for it. And I think go ahead.
No, and so there are outside forces, as Bab says, that are taking advantage essentially of that thirst for either comfort or the better representation of truth, as I've heard it called, sense making.
Okay.
Right? The other thing she said is maybe it's time for Facebook to be subject to libel laws for user content, just like a print news source. And the one thing that we didn't talk about, you talked about First Amendment, right? But we didn't talk about the specific platform protections under Section 230 of whatever.
I forget the actual
FCC
act.
Regulations
It's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
That's it.
That states that platforms are not liable for the content that third-party users post to their platforms, with some carefully enumerated exceptions. The law, as author Senator Ron Wyden has explained it, gives platforms, quote, a sword and shield, a sword that allows them to moderate and a shield that protects them from liability. Mm-hmm. That was from that same Slate article, so I saw that it just happened to be there.
Ken and Babs are hitting on it too, right? When we talked about social media being the public square, I said that you should just nationalize it all. That the government should come in and take it all over, and then
that's the most anti-capitalist thing I've ever heard you say. Yeah,
that's because I'm not really a hardcore capitalist. I'm just not one of these people who thinks we should punish success. I am not capable of coming up with an idea that allows me to be a multi-billionaire, but I don't begrudge the people who do.
Come on, we just got to do the WWE approach of covering politics. I'm telling you, that network would kill.
Well, yes. And then I'd go and buy a boat. But Elon Musk deserves to be a billionaire.
Fair.
He just does, right? So yes,
and deserves to be taxed for it.
Sure, agreed. And there's a system to come up with it. I'm in one of those kind of tax systems right now, and every now and then I grumble about the fact that my tax rate is high. And then I get reminded that I would be paying for healthcare if I was in America. So even though my tax rate is lower, I would actually be paying about the same in the end because I'd have to buy insurance, which I don't have to do here.
It's not tied to it's not tied to your business or like the work that you do. What? You can have healthcare regardless if you're employed at the moment, or the same healthcare if you're working at McDonald's than if you're working at a corporate giant. What is that nonsense? Anyhow, I have no idea. I digress.
But if the government takes it over, there are First Amendment protections, right, associated with social media, and then you can tie everybody's posts to their real name.
Yep. So that's where could it exist? Could that system exist? Yes. But my challenge is I don't see how you take away from private companies creating their own things. In the same way that Twitter exists, right, and Parler tried to exist and does again in some form, that's capitalism, right? That is allowing companies to provide a service and people to choose whether or not to use that service. And
so
cool.
By the same method that the American government went in and took over Countrywide and not Countrywide, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Okay.
In the middle of the financial crisis. They didn't ask permission, they just did it.
Well, so the other side of that though is what keeps government Facebook from existing when Facebook 2.0 comes out from another private company? Or do we make it illegal for any company to create what was arguably a social media type of existence? Do we not allow Mayway or whatever that is, Waymay or whatever? Do we not allow any of those to exist unless they are government run? Because that's the challenge, right? Government could take over Facebook, and Facebook could turn over next door and say, "Hi, we're now Chessbook," and guess what? Everyone's going to use Chessbook because Facebook
we're not Facebook, we're Feetbook.
Right, whatever, right? Pick your fetish. And
social media fetish website.
Could be a thing, could kill.
Ew.
Not just in a subreddit or in a 4.8 or higher chan. You can, but yeah, no. It's my problem is like, yes, we could advocate for some environment to exist where social media could be regulated by the government in some form. Cool, but I don't know if I agree with the idea of trying to usurp it from existing companies. Now, I think there's a different discussion to be had, and actually, I didn't know where to fit this in, but I kind of want to put it here, just so I can bring it up, because this isn't tied to what we'll talk more about next week about the manipulation of the markets and such. But from Inc.com, just an interesting perspective as we're talking about social media and Facebook and stuff. Tim Cook, this came up in my social media feed today. It says, may have just ended Facebook. That's the title of it. It's kind of beyond that. But what this talks about is that in a recent speech at Brussels International Data Privacy Day, Apple CEO Tim Cook went on an offensive against Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, saying Cook's speech seems to be a direct response to Facebook's recent attack on Apple, in which the world's largest social media network took out a full-page ad in several newspapers attacking Apple's new privacy changes.
Okay.
What's great is what Tim Cook said. I wanted to share this for people who didn't see it, and I'll link it in here for anyone who wants to read it themselves. Technology does not need to be okay, let me quote this right. Technology does not need vast troves of personal data stitched together across dozens of websites and apps in order to succeed. Advertising existed and thrived for decades without it. And we're here today because the path of least resistance is rarely the path of wisdom. If a business is built on misleading users, on data exploitation, on choices that are no choices at all, then it does not deserve our praise. It deserves reform. We should not look away from the bigger picture, and a moment of rapid disinformation and conspiracy theory is juiced by algorithms. We can no longer turn a blind eye to a theory of technology that says all engagement is good engagement, the longer the better, and all with the goal of collecting as much data as possible. Too many are still asking the question, how much can we get away with? When they need to be asking, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of prioritizing conspiracy theories and violent incitement simply because of the higher rate of engagement? What are the consequences of not just tolerating but rewarding content that undermines public trust in life-saving vaccinations? What are the consequences of seeing thousands of users join extremist groups and then perpetuating an algorithm that recommends even more? It is long past time to stop pretending that this approach doesn't come with a cause. A polarization of lost trust and, yes, of violence. A social dilemma cannot be allowed to become a social catastrophe. The article says that, Cook doesn't name Facebook directly, but does talk to essentially how Facebook is utilizing our data, and somewhere else in there talks about how it is wrong. Let's see. Oh, yeah. But collecting and selling data comes at a great cost. As Cook highlights, quote, the end result of all of this is that you are no longer the customer. You are the product. Yep. And it's an interesting conversation, right? And then he goes from the Apple perspective, right? We believe that ethical technology is technology that works for you. It's technology that helps you sleep, not keeps you up. It tells you when you've had enough. It gives you a space to create or draw or write or learn, not refresh just one more time.
Okay.
I do give Tim Cook credit. That's a well-worded dig for what he's trying to say.
I wouldn't trust him to be the arbiter of truth any more than I would trust Zuckerberg or
that's a challenge, right?
Jack Dorsey or any of these other technocrats.
He is not without blame. He is not. Yeah, he is not perfect in all of this in any means, right? But I give credit.
I don't trust any of these people, and that's the problem, right? So the reason why I go, to Axios for my news, the reason why I go to Rogan to hear people speak is because, some of these people don't have a chance to speak, right? What news media outlet after the so-called Square hoax broke, right? Well, this was the three people that wrote a bunch of research papers for what they called grievance studies, but is really the critical theory journals.
Okay.
They wrote a bunch of papers that were just a bunch of word. They used all the jargon.
Okay.
From from critical theory and just pieced the stuff together and wrote bullcrap, and like a third of their papers got published, won an award for exemplary scholarship.
Okay.
Right? So why? Well, I mean, why? What media outlet is going to interview those people and talk to them? What mainstream media outlet is gonna talk to those people? No one. So I have to do it on Rogan. Like, what mainstream media outlet is going to talk to? I don't know. Yeah. So instead of coming up, I'll just talk about it broadly. That's the reason why I go to Rogan, is because I got a higher likelihood of listening. Oh, perfect! I came up with one. Tulsi Gabbard, right?
Okay.
What mainstream media outlet? I mean, she's been on Fox News a couple of times lately. She was on Fox News during the campaign, but that's I don't want to have to go seek that stuff out at Fox News, because, right, we all know that Fox News has bias, right? We all know that. We all know that. So I want what the New York Times used to be, and I don't know in what time frame, but I want what the New York Times used to be as the newspaper of record to do the interview with Tulsi Gabbard, so I don't have to go to Rogan.
Okay.
Right? Or Andrew Yang, another perfect example. Right? I found out about Andrew Yang's stuff from Rogan. You certainly weren't going to find it out at any of the debates. Right? And they were never going to get a fair shake right after the first Dem primary debate. CNN went on the air and said that Tulsi Gabbard was a Russian plant. Right? And it's not like we're talking about a propaganda network. It's not like we're talking about MSNBC. It's not like we're talking about Fox News. CNN went on and said, well, she's really working for the Russian government. Right? Which is where that you can use that lie, right, or that piece of misinformation that Russia's like meddling in everything, for anything. And in fact, on CNBC this week, spoiler alert for next week, y'all, somebody on CNBC said or heavily hinted that Wall Street bets and the short squeeze on GameStop stock was the result of Russians. That was said this week.
Okay. So one of the challenges I do have is because when one of the issues, right, and this goes into even what was stated about who's liable for what information. If is it
while you're
well, I was just going to say, is it the responsibility of the source that's presenting it if it's not one of their people saying it, if it's a guest kind of thing? Because I run into that all the time where it's like, it's one thing where the liability of these groups giving voice, right, to an opinion versus they themselves expressing, and the other side of it is the responsibility of them to perhaps present a counter to a point made. And that's something I still see juggled constantly, because I have heard some outrageous crap spoken by some guests, and it didn't matter the network, right? I've seen CNN interviewing, Kellyanne Conway, and her just spouting garbage, let alone tweeting naked pictures of her 16-year-old daughter, because that was illegal. But that, she got away with, essentially, because she was given a platform and was able to speak. And even though she has no representation of what CNN was doing at the time, it made it out there. I don't know. So it's a weird statement, but yes, if it's for me, if it's the actual people hired by, paid for by, whatever, presenting their opinions, they need to be held to account.
No, that's a really good
want
point.
networks
and to be fair,
counter people.
To be fair, in the case of CNBC, Jim Cramer jumped on that guy immediately. He's just like, give me a break. Like,
well, that's the thing, right? Because
nobody believes.
You can't stop some people from spouting garbage once they're on there.
No.
And we've seen this happen a ton of times, or at least I have, where you think you're talking about one subject and they're like, yeah. And then they take that moment to be like, and blah, 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 and you're just like, how do I respond to that? Oh, my.
And so maybe we should get away from all this talking head crap and get back to...
I would love that.
Relaying the facts to the American electorate.
I would love that.
The facts.
Yep. Well, and that's part of the conversation that came up earlier. This is between combination of what Legend was saying, Babs, my older brother Babs, and even Ken was saying, is that, but what do we do now, right? Where do I go for sources? What's available? And you were even saying it there about how do I find where I can hear people talk about various subjects? And the problem is that, I don't think this is a problem that's ever changed. I think the difference is in the negative fact, we have more access to information than ever before, good and bad. Mm-hmm. And it used to be, I can going to show the graybeard here. I remember when there were all of like 3 channels on TV, right? Where getting UHF, VHF, and having to click to get through the handful of stations. And where I remember when you only had a news broadcast or two, and heaven forbid, the signal went off at a certain point at the night, and there was no TV until the morning, and you got the little pattern.
Yep.
And it's changed where now you have so much access that anybody, we create a show for basically nothing that could get, as much as we have a handful of viewers live right now and however many people watch us offline, there's nothing that stops this show from having tomorrow 10 million views, right? Maybe we spark an interest in something. You and I have no credentials. We are opining all day long.
If you really want 10 million views, I could start taking my clothes off for money.
It's just, but that's the thing, right? We can't really control it, and we're not admittedly pressing to get that. We have never pressed that we are trying to actively become the next whatever sensation. We are presenting hopefully things that are entertaining to all of you.
And that was why at the top of this hour I said perceived asymmetry, because again, I know that I have blind spots, and it's impossible to track all of social media plus what's being commented about on YouTube plus all you just can't.
Yep.
Right? So we only have 4 minutes left. I want to
and we didn't even talk about short stocks today.
I know. But that's what I want to spend the last 4 minutes doing.
Or saying like how Dogecoin was part of the thing and why it's not $1 yet.
I know.
Sorry, go ahead, Todd.
Right. So what we talked a little bit about Wall Street bets and GameStop earlier in the show, where Business Insider had written an article and said that Wall Street bets was tied to the alt-right. Yeah. We just talked about the CNBC thing where one of the guys tried to imply that Wall Street bets has been infiltrated by the Russians, and Kramer sort of smacked him upside the head for saying that. It is going to be a very interesting week, and the reason why is because this does not look like it's going to slow down at all.
I'm really curious to see what happens with this, because
right.
I mean, there was a lot of adjustment that happened for various reasons, and
I want to save all of that, litigating all of that for next week, because I want Ken here too.
Yeah,
and
I do too.
There's some really, really important stuff is going to happen starting tomorrow, because what I heard and read over the weekend is that the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is going to brief Biden about what's happening.
Well, it makes sense, because he was asked at the press, or he was asked at a briefing, and his press secretary was asked like the day it was happening what the White House opinion on GameStop stock was, specifically asked in the press secretary.
I love the response from the press secretary too. It's like, yep, our our Treasury secretary sure does have lady parts. Like that was it. That was all they had.
Well, they admittedly were like, we haven't done anything with this yet.
I don't care about your diversity initiatives for the sake of diversity. I care about the fact that the Treasury Secretary has taken $800,000 in speaking fees from the hedge fund that's behind, or from one of the funds that's behind Robinhood, which suspended buying of GameStop stock while this thing was going on, and caused some major temporary correction in the stock price after hours, where it's theorized that all of these short sellers, or some number of these short sellers, got out of their position when
That's how they protected themselves from losing billions
to 120. And there should be considerations of insider trading.
From a high of 350, almost 400 down to.
And we should be having a conversation about conflict of interest between the Treasury Secretary and the hedge funds that she was paid speaking fees to go talk to. My suspicion is what's going to happen is Wall Street Bets gets investigated, and Robinhood does not.
It will. Well, I do give credit, at least, to, as much as you bring up comments about, AOC did tweet out right away of saying, hey, I'm on this board, and I think we need to look at what happened with Robinhood, and I am all in favor of investigating them. AOC was quick to do that.
Yes, any event that causes AOC and Ted Cruz to be on the same side seems like there's going to be action. I'm just skeptical about the biggest collection of corporatists ever assembled, if they're really going to take action in the way that they should, or if they're going to back up their donors. So we'll see. I will be cautiously optimistic. We do have to talk about this because I think it's so funny. Starting tomorrow, there are going to be billboards up in several cities across the nation talking about Wall Street Bets and GME.
Yep, by GME.
And GameStop, that have been
Times
bought.
Square has already posted some, like on the digital boards.
Times Square had an ad. There's a town in Florida, Salt Lake City, is going to have a bunch of billboards talking about Wall Street Bets and GameStop. And there's going to be some out in California. Those are the ones I know for sure that people have been talking about. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the billboards. And what's really interesting is that's going to fuel the fire of the mainstream media to come up with a narrative for this. And it will be really interesting to see over this next week what that narrative is going to be. And you can find out next week on ShowX on Twitch.tv.
It will be very interesting to see. With this, though, one of the biggest challenges today, everybody, is trusted news sources, trusted services. I've stated this multiple times on the show. When it comes to social media, specifically, and you see things posted, if they cause a gut reaction in the initial post from the headline or whatever it is, two things. Mm-hmm. One, click through on things and actually read them. Don't just retweet, reshare stuff that's just a headline. That's probably the biggest mistake you can make. And then second, if it seems to be too good to be true, too bad to be true, just do a quick search on DuckDuckGo or something, right? On whatever search engine you choose. Do a quick search and see what articles come up. I have, with almost no effort, been able to see the truth or falsehood of a post with one page of search, let alone if you have services you tend to trust, like a fact check service, Snopes or something, that in your opinion, has traditionally kept you on track, right? And can most of them, the good ones, source their reasons for believing what they believe. And whatever's being posted has reached the threshold of them needing to comment on it. Use those services. I've been flamed by friends who've been mad that I fact-checked them on both ends of stuff because I was like, yeah, that thing you shared, your numbers are garbage. What it's stating is a falsehood. Here's the real numbers, and here's my source. I think your opinion is still accurate, but you should probably use accurate numbers, right?
It would be fun to compile a list of media folklore. Right, the long-standing narratives that turned out not to be
true. Not to be true.
Yeah. I think that would be really interesting to crowdsource that and see what everybody came up with, and do it like as a brainstorming session, so that no proposed piece of folklore gets annihilated immediately, and then sometime later you would go through it and say, well, yeah, I guess that's okay as folklore, maybe not this other one, I think that would be interesting. One of the things that I guess I want to kind of end this on, something that came up in my YouTube feed that I hadn't really thought about is that there's a major contraction in online media jobs.
Okay.
And it's huge. There's a huge, and in fact, even more so in the enthusiast media. I saw it on a Clownfish TV YouTube video where they were talking about like 3 or 4 different websites that are shutting down or consolidating, and all of their writers are getting moved to other places, or losing their jobs outright, or getting laid off. I also saw that video also had a post in it about pay structure for these articles, and that's also a big problem. Because one, these people are massively undercompensated, and you shouldn't be surprised by that because lots of people are massively undercompensated, and the way to maximize content is to put either a huge number of really, really short, like garbage posts, or the super huge long form articles. Because part of what they're compensated on is word count. As word count and click count were sort of the two things that they were compensated on. They're compensated on word count and bonused on click count, which would incentivize you to write the most inflammatory, sort of true if you squint hard enough type of content. And I think that might be part of the problem with trust in the media too. So just wanted to tie that off. Next week on Show X, Octail takes his clothes off on camera for you.
An article for every new follow, for every new subscribe. What's the thing that always says, like, click the bell, the alert if you want to hear more, the YouTubes and the Facebooks.
Make sure you smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and hit the bell.
Right?
By the way, I ain't taking my clothes off for anybody.
Anyhow, thank you guys for joining us this week. There's a lot that can be said about this. Unfortunately, I don't think we have any one answer for how to deal with this trying time of information. It takes work. That's part of the problem. The best advice I can say is don't be lazy. If you want to be aware of things, you're going to have to go a step further and read, click through, find other sources, and arguably, my opinion is, pay attention to the sources, because everybody out there, and I've seen too many examples of this, can pick up a site name that says absolutely thetruthinnews.org or whatever, And it doesn't mean that they're worth a damn thing, right? Check for credentials, check who's writing the articles, check if things are listed as opinion or fact. Please don't share opines as your basis for an argument. You know, when you start it by, look at this article I'm sharing and it's obviously just someone's opinion from wherever, that carries no weight. Now, if you discuss something they bring up as a point and provide links to actual information about it, that might have value. But just reposting garbage because it makes you feel good is probably one of the biggest contributions to the misinformation that's happening today through social media. You can nip it in the butt. You can stop it, don't share it, and you can even comment.
It's unfortunate in this environment where everybody's sort of overworked. Those of us that have jobs are sort of overworked, kinda. That we have to do even more work in our free time to do a job that other people should be doing for us, like ombudsman. But unfortunately, like it falls to us. So the responsibility for this stuff falls to us.
It does. I mean, we have to be our own curators to a degree. And if you're lucky, you'll find someone who's doing a good job of it. And if you do, keep to them. But just like I've seen a lot of gals I've known in my past, the way they are with their hairdressers, right? You follow them and you keep them as long as they treat you right and they do good. But as soon as they misbehave and give you that bad cut, maybe it's time to look elsewhere. You know, be careful with your loyalty. All right. With that, it's going to be time for us to get out of here. Expect us to talk more about what's going on in Wall Street and that fun tag and how it comes to us as gamers in that the resurrection to some weird degree of a company that arguably is dead. But the whys, the hows, the what's going on with it, we'll get into that next week. We'll see what's happened over this week that's coming. I do note that as a preemption to curiosity for tomorrow, I don't know if you watched the last Linus Tech Tip Wan show where he got all on board with the idea of screwing the rich and people who are shorting stuff and commented that he would match 5 times the donation towards buying GameStop stock if from all the super chats he was getting that day.
Oh my God.
He had to cap it in about 20 minutes at $50K US of his match because he got 10K in super chats that quick of people saying, put your money where your mouth is. And it's a good thing to watch because you can see him having a crisis on air as he, at the advice of his co-host, called his wife during the show to let her know she needed to set aside $50K of their personal money to invest, and her reaction of it. A little bit of online gold of what happens in live broadcasting. And if you pay attention to facial expressions, there is some nuance to like, I hope I have all my body parts tomorrow.
So what you never, ever, ever, ever do on the internet is ask the internet to call your bluff.
And
you just don't do that. That's hilarious, though.
Yeah, and he basically did the whole like, I promised it, therefore I must.
Yeah. Well, so, I'll tell you what. Props to him for not going. No, I didn't think it was going to be 50K. So
yeah, no, it was worth watching. Where I was just like, ooh, I could feel what's going on in his mind. He had one of those shows like I've had after a bad week, but live on air where it swung.
Yeah,
where you could see him go like, ooh, deflate, internal processing. Co-host having to pick up the slack for a second. And him like, I'm here, okay, but then still having a few moments of like, I think we're done. Yep, show's done. I got to go face the music.
Here's the thing: a $50,000 injection into GameStop is going to bump the price.
It'll have an effect.
It sure will.
And so it'll be interesting to see. And I think because of what he's doing, it's not going to hit, of course, until tomorrow. And so that'll be part of a bump tomorrow. It'll be really interesting to watch what's all happening.
It is going to be really interesting.
All right, but no, we got to get out of here. Please follow us on all we're doing. We'd love to hear your opinions on what we've talked about the show, things you're observing anywhere in geekdom and technology. feel free to email us in at VtWShowX@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. As well as check out all the links if you'd like to follow Todd, myself, Ken, every one of us, the other shows that he and we do. So if you want to check out on Wednesday where my pro's at, although we'll see if it's going this week or not. But check it out. Please check out our Linktree. That is where you're going to find everything we're about. I don't think I have it on this screen. Darn it. I have it on the other one. I think I added the Linktree. But
dun, dun, dun.
Right. Poor me. But for those who want to see it, our Linktree is at ShowX when you check out Linktree. And it's linkr.ee, I think is a Linktree link. So check that out for all the links and follow us on all the different platforms we exist on. Love to hear from you. Thank you for following us. As always, share us. You know, if you think our conversations are interesting, discuss, share it out, because that's the only thing we really do ask. You're welcome to help us on Patreon. It does pay the little bills we have.
Don't pass on that like button. Smash that like button.
Follow us on Twitch. Check us out. Follow us on Facebook and follow us on YouTube. Whatever we get helps. I mean, right now we don't monetize any of that really, but we'd like to grow to the audience, because anything we get back, we invest directly back into the show. So awesome. With that, we'll catch you guys later, and a very big salute to all of you guys for watching and checking us out, and we will catch you again next week. All right, guys, Bye-bye. We're out of here. Have a good one.
Goodbye. See you next zombie.